What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to the podcast known as America Trends Podcast. I'm Larry Rifkin along with John Krofsick. And John, today we're going to be talking about a topic that I don't think a lot of people could imagine going back to a particular institution that we held as very important to our society many years ago. But maybe there's a new way of looking at this kind of institution. And you recall the large facilities right here in our state of Connecticut, and they happen to be all across the country, I believe, asylums for those who are mentally ill. And we used to think that that was a very humane and appropriate use of a large facility.
Well, on the other hand, I think we do need to do something because we're using our jails as asylums now, and it's sad. We got a system right now that doesn't deal with this problem at all. So we got to do something.
Well, yeah, we talk about community programs for those who have mental illness, and yet we never put enough money into that. And we end up seeing a lot of folks who might be simply homeless or just might be disoriented, and they end up in jail. And there is no treatment, as you say, in jail for them. In fact, 37% of all prison inmates suffer some mental illness. But we did close down a lot of those big institutions thinking, well, just as we did with those who had mental retardation, not feeling that that was any longer the modern day approach that we should be taking.
Well, I think we did better with, we let them into society. It's become more acceptable, but with, mental illness, we haven't dealt with that. I don't think we've dealt with that at all. I know my daughter deals with this problem all the time. People that really need help and can't get help, and it's a tough go.
Well, I know those we used to call mentally retarded, now developmental disabilities, and we decided that group homes and being part of the community very important. And I think we recognize that even with mental illness, but we just don't have enough programs. And the question is there any way to take some of these incredible institutions that now are fallow and revisit them for a new approach to mental illness, and not isolating them, but bringing them into society in a different way? And is that a good idea or not? And I was really fascinated. I saw a piece in the Wall Street Journal, and the title was Bring Back the Asylum. A new generation of institutions would help reduce the vast numbers of mentally ill adults in jails and prisons. And I really wanted to talk about this, John, because I think, it's always good to revisit. Maybe we haven't thought of all the options available to us, and we know that mental illness is really a problem in our society that we have got to get our arms around. We know that.
Yeah, it's a problem in our emergency rooms. We're paying for it already all around us with the jails, with the police department, with hospitals. We really need to deal with it as a public to do something right for these people.
So can we reimagine what that might look like? And would a large institution, perhaps, that is very different than the ones we left to lie fallow all these years, is that possible? We're going to discuss it with Howard Husock, and he is with the Manhattan Institute. He and Carolyn D. Gorman put this piece together that I used as the basis for this conversation in the Wall Street Journal. Take a listen. I think you're going to find this very interesting. Our next guest is Howard Husock, and he is Vice President for Research and Publications at the Manhattan Institute. Along with Carolyn Gorman, he wrote a provocative op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal titled Bring Back the Asylum. Now, Howard, is it fair to say that your interest in the topic of how we treat those who have mental illness goes back to another piece that you wrote back in 2017 in City Journal entitled Dreams of My Uncle, in which you pose this question: are we treating the mentally ill better today than we did a century ago? How would you answer that question?
Well, I think in some ways, yes. There are people with serious mental illness who have terrific access to private psychiatry and drugs that didn't exist a century ago, and many of those people are much better off than they would have been. At the same time, my concern, both in the article about my late uncle, who I wrote about in the article you referred to in City Journal, and in the more recent article in the Wall Street Journal, is about those with persistent mental illness who are also impoverished and may not have access to the best medical care. And I think in that case, in those cases, we are failing them compared to a century ago.
In what way?
We have ways of helping people today, and we're not doing the best we can for them. A century ago, psychiatric drugs didn't exist. We did know, however, enough to keep people safe and warm and off the street and in a reasonably comfortable situation. Asylums have a bad name in retrospect, but they were not always places of abuse and horror, certainly not when they were new. And so given what we were able to do at the time and given what we're now able to do, we are seeing people who are in prison and on our streets and in homeless encampments who are clearly not getting the best of what we have to offer today.
When you hear conversations today in our society about mental illness, oftentimes they're associated with some horrific event, and it really misses the point. We see, of course, that suicides are going up in our society. We see a lot of people who are very, very stressed and anxious about their lives. I mean, put it all together, when you hear this conversation, given the fact that you've had a family association with this, do you think we're really even getting to the point?
I'm not qualified to make broad generalizations about psychiatric care. My focus really is on those with persistent and serious mental illness who we now call something called homeless, and who now we consign to prisons, which have become our new mental asylums. Those are the people I was thinking about and who I think most about in answer to your question when the phrase mental illness comes up. Many people struggle with a range of anxieties and conditions. My focus in both the Wall Street Journal article and the City Journal article has been on those who really have the most serious illnesses, bipolar disorder, paranoid schizophrenia. It's just a scandal that you go to the Portland, Oregon homeless encampments, to the streets of San Francisco, the streets of New York, the jails, the Cook County Jail, which has been called our largest mental asylum in this country. This is a scandal that we're consigning people to these kinds of conditions.
In your article in the Wall Street Journal, you say that 37% of all prison inmates suffer some mental illness. Frankly, I'm surprised the number isn't a bit higher than that. How did we even arrive at that number?
Well, the federal government tracks this kind of thing, and there's a self-reporting that goes on as a result of jails and correctional institutions being asked. Also, we can track how many people are receiving prescription drugs behind bars, and that's a very good indicator of this. Now, that's not to say that almost anybody behind bars is a troubled person, but to actually be diagnosed with a psychiatric illness, we need a stronger indicator, and certainly the number of prescription drugs being purchased by correctional systems and administered is a good way to figure that out.
Maybe you can go back a bit over the history of how we have treated mental illness in America and then end up at this place where prisons have become the de facto dumping ground for many in our society who have exhibited mental illness. So take us back a ways, perhaps to Dorothea Dix, and then give us a quick survey.
Well, it's really ironic, Larry. We've come full circle. In the early 19th century, as we became an industrialized society, people who were poor and people who were mentally ill and poor began to be treated in different ways. When we were an agrarian society, families took care of people, and remember, lifespans were short as well. But as we became wealthier and industrialized, we needed to find more formal ways to deal with people who were exhibiting antisocial behaviors of various kinds. And so we developed jails and prisons, of course, but we also found that there were a class of people in those jails and prisons who suffered from mental illness. And the woman you mentioned, Dorothea Dix, who was a famous reformer of the early 19th century from Boston, made it her personal crusade to try to spring the mentally ill from the sordid conditions of jails, and was responsible for setting off a wave of asylum building. Asylums were the reform of their era in the mid to late 19th century. They weren't something to be looked down upon. They were the best that we had to offer, and we invested tremendous amounts of money in them at the time. One of my favorite examples is the Ohio State Reformatory in Lima, Ohio, which was built in the early 20th century, was the largest poured concrete structure in the world until the Pentagon was built.
Yeah,
it had 17 wings. We invested, typically, asylums were the largest budget item in state budgets at the time. And so we were helping families cope with loved ones who they couldn't care for at home, and we were keeping those loved ones in what many times were constructive situations where they performed labor in the asylums. They grew their own food many times. They were responsible for the upkeep, even as they were overseen. So in the early 20th century, asylums were desirable in that way. We were doing the right thing. Now, they always held, when you have an institution with 17 wings, they actually held a lot of the elderly poor who had no place to go, people with persistent physical illnesses, including syphilis, which in the pre-antibiotic era was a tremendous problem. We built asylums for the tubercular. And so there was a need to find institutional settings for a wide range of people, but certainly the mentally ill were housed in those asylums. Then, to continue this history, that was your question,
Sure.
It became harder to, as these institutions aged, other demands became apparent on state budgets, and in some situations, the conditions in the asylums became scandalous. And there were famous exposés in Life magazine and documentary films, and they helped to fuel an anti-institutionalization. It became a de-institutionalization movement, in part because they coincided, these poor conditions coincided with an intellectual anti-institutional movement, including a very influential, if perhaps not that well-known book called The Myth of Mental Illness by a psychiatrist named Thomas Szasz. And the idea took root that we shouldn't judge the mentally ill. They had their own reality. And who were we to say that they were ill? And so that, as well as budget pressures, became a perfect storm to close down mental asylums.
Well, I know in
And
Connecticut, where we come from, closing down these large institutions. At the same time, we were looking at these training schools for the mentally retarded, and we were saying maybe that's not the best approach, even though at one time that was the gold standard in the way that we were caring for people who had various conditions. I remember Frederick Wiseman did a film that had to have some impact. So put this together, when we have these better ideas and we're going to mainstream and bring people back into the community, where did that fall down?
well, first of all, it's not an entirely wrong idea. Certainly, people with developmental disabilities, those we used to call retarded, can often live productive, if modest lives, and there's no reason that they should be barred from that. And people with serious mental illness can be treated and live in the community. Most can be treated and live in the community because we have effective psychiatric drugs. Of course, you have to take those effective psychiatric drugs for them to be. The big difference in the asylum era is involuntary commitment and involuntary norm. The deinstitutionalization movement changed all that. If we could do one thing, situation would be to allow family members to insist treatment for their loved ones. Medication, they don't have in asylums. Most. There are some who are more difficult. I'm not a psychiatrist. I want to claim, I'm told that there are some who are more difficult to treat. There's a small percentage, and it is a small percentage, but it is there. But we can reinvent the asylum, not the sprawling asylums of the early 20th century, but asylums that can be thought of more like old age homes. They don't even necessarily have to have lots, but we have to make sure that people take the medication that will be effective, and we have to make sure that they remain under some supervision in what's called supportive housing. But we need the full range. That was the point that Carolyn Gorman and I were making in the Wall Street Journal article. We need that full range of institutional types. Some people on asylum, some people have to have community care and what's called supportive housing. Some people may be able to live with family members who make sure they take their medication. But it's important that that full range, the full spectrum of possible treatments exist, and that spectrum should not include homeless encampment.
And I want to talk to you about the fact that, perhaps there are examples for more therapeutic communities, but you do say in the article, face the same problem that Dix found, that treatment for mental illness is fundamentally inconsistent with imprisonment, and then you quote another study related to this. So as a progressive society, or a society that continues to evolve and look for more humane ways to, help people in our society, how did we end up where we're back to the prison being the locus? And when are we going to start looking at these different forms of asylum or community that allow people really to be helped and responded to based upon their own circumstance?
Well, certainly nobody enough policy to warehouse the mentally ill in jails and prisons. It just kind of happened, and it happened this way. If you deinstitutionalize people and they don't take their medication and you don't insist that they take their medication, then they're likely to encounter problems and to cause problems. Problems cause them to get arrested. And as that happened more and more and more, the ranks of the mentally ill swelled in our jails and prisons. And so it was certainly not a self-conscious policy. But there you have it. You have large numbers.
And so as we look at the things that you're suggesting might represent a new collection of thought and idea in this realm, do you see this going on? Are there states that are modeling various new forms of dealing with mental illness, and they're doing it successfully?
I think that it's starting to bubble. A few states that have made some of them understand that they can be really important and they should not be subject to an ongoing shutdown, phase out. I would not say that in general an asylum-oriented movement is taking off. And I think one of their barriers is the federal government. When the Medicaid Act was passed in 1965, it specifically excluded support for individuals who were in large institutions because the thought those should be paid for by the. It didn't want to get on the hook items at the state level. The federal government would, however, pay for people to be in community facilities, and so states just said, "Oh, we get it. Let's just close down the big facilities. We'll shift everybody onto Medicaid, and we'll get this off our budgets." So the federal government added fuel to the fire that was fueled by this intellectual anti-institutionalization movement as well. And that's why if we're going to start to move things back into a more common sense range of treatment options approach, the federal government has to revisit that policy. Nothing should bar an individual from being eligible for Medicaid if he or she is in a state institution.
Do you see any movement in that direction from the federal government? I know that
I think so.
You do.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, can we have true prison reform without addressing the composition or the population of these prisons?
Well, Health and Human Services Department has a mental health component to it, and there's a new commissioner there, director there. Her name is Eleanor McCants-Katz. She's on the record as saying we've got to try to balance back here to have at least some safe instincts. When she was the commissioner of mental health in Rhode Island, so there are some thought leaders in this area and some appointed officials trying to push things back. Prison reform, I think, has mainly been focused on sentencing reforms and related items, and has not turned its attention to. It's more focused on sure everybody who's be there. Now that's you to a place where the people who have mental illness-related problems aren't put behind bars, even if they've committed a crime. In some states, including New York, there are mental health courts which are emerging, and people into treatment rather than sentencing them to prison. This is a good trend, and we should hope that it spreads.
You, Jeffrey Geller, medical director at the Worcester Recovery, throughout Bring Back the Asylum in the Wall Street Journal, and you say that he's proposing that public treatment is a sort of patient voucher accompanying a patient in any treatment setting. Is that a good concept as you see it?
I definitely think it's the right way to go. The government, if it's going to provide for the infirm for whatever reasons, it ought to be indifferent to the medical which is best for them. In other words, if the medical setting in a institution is judged to be the best medical setting for somebody, the federal government should not say, well, no, we as a matter of policy don't support people in institutions. Why is that a good idea? Should people have only that choice, which may have been the case half a century or a century ago? Well, no, that's not right either. But it should be part of what's on offer. And the federal government, really in the interest of saving money, should want to make sure that people are treated, helped to recover, to get to a stable situation, and then only then released to the community where they're going to continue to be treated and treat themselves. The idea that we should exclude any one form of treatment is Dr. Gellis from Massachusetts, from what is really a model institution in Worcester, Massachusetts, makes that point very clearly, and I agree with him.
In your piece, you said many of the asylums of the previous era still stand, often empty and eerie. Not want to reopen those actual facilities, but it's time to acknowledge that closing them has left a vacuum that must be filled. Is there even a way to retrofit or repurpose some of these facilities into a new or have most of them gone to seed over the years?
Well, of course, you'd have to take that on a case-by-case basis. Some of these are historic and architecturally impressive buildings. Mm-hmm. Buffalo, New York has a large former campus of a state mental hospital, the famous St. Richardson. Many of these could be repurposed, and you'd have to know, anytime you do historic preservation and renovation, it's a close call. Is it renovate or to start anew? And many of these facilities and that may not be the best way for family members to stay in touch. Some of them aren't. There's no reason they should be necessarily written off.
Well, your piece, in closing, has this wonderful photograph of Massachusetts's Gold Farm, and you see residents gardening, feeding animals, preparing meals, participating in fitness activities, maintaining walking trails. Is this one of the ideas that perhaps we should be considering as a society?
Well, that's exactly right. Institutions don't have to boards in which people cower in straight. Not how it's done anymore. If it was ever done universally that way, and it wants to have a structured set. There are constructive activities for people to help them recover. Is common sense. Institutions like Old Farm and others around the country have long modeled this, even while states and the federal government have turned away. The idea that the asylums of old were universally helped, not true. There were some that were very well run, and with the right kind of accountability, they can be well. I an institute which is, people say it believes in small government. We'd like to think we believe in the government we need and effective government. But this is an area in which all Americans should agree we have a moral and a practical role for government. When people are poor and suffer from mental illness, they're not going to be able to take care of themselves. We have to take care of them, and ways have to become new.
Howard Husock, thank you very much for being with us today on America Trends. And again, our conversation framed by the piece that he and Carolyn Gorman wrote in the Wall Street Journal called Back the Asylum. A new institutions would help reduce the vast numbers of mentally ill adults in jails and prisons. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Larry. Thanks for having me.